Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Susan Hearn, CEO of Germane Solutions, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Building a Sustainable Accreditation Strategy, Creating a Culture of Continuous Readiness. During today's webinar, attendees will learn how to develop a sustainable framework for year-round accreditation readiness, implement systems to monitor compliance and mitigate risk proactively, build accountability across institutional and program leadership, and create a culture focused on continuous improvement rather than episodic accreditation preparation. Before I introduce today's speakers, there's a few administrative items to note. Participants have been muted upon entry to the session. If for any reason your audio is showing as unmuted, please mute yourself to eliminate background noise during the presentation. We've made every effort to reduce technical issues. If you have problems, please indicate them to Hunter Rich in a private chat. The slide presentation and the webinar broadcast are provided exclusively for the use of registrants and should not be shared. Reproducing, distributing, or transmitting any session materials of the live presentation to any group or individual requires express permission from Germane Solutions. If you have questions throughout the session, please submit them in the chat feature. We encourage you to ask your questions as they come up, as well as during our dedicated question and answer time at the end of the session. If we cannot get through all the questions in the allotted time, or if you have a question you don't want to share publicly, please submit them via email afterwards to Hunter Rich. Every registered participant for this session will receive an email containing a link to our survey so we can obtain feedback on the webinar. The survey is brief and we encourage your comments. Now let me introduce our speakers, Alyson Wohlleber and Claire Hauck. Alyson is a manager at Germane Solutions and brings 6 years of experience in graduate medical education to today's conversation. She specializes in residency and fellowship program development, strategic planning, feasibility assessments, and program operations with a particular focus on accreditation compliance and sustainable growth. Alyson works closely with both new and established teaching institutions to strengthen GME infrastructure, maintain regulatory compliance, and align educational programs with broader organization and workforce priorities. Claire is a manager at Germane Solutions and previously served as the firm's accreditation service line lead. She brings more than 7 years of healthcare experience with extensive expertise in GME accreditation and compliance. Claire has supported health systems at programmatic, institutional, and system levels through special reviews, comprehensive accreditation assessments, administrative infrastructure evaluations, at-risk program support, faculty development, program closures, and other complex accreditation and operational initiatives. Together, Alyson and Claire bring extensive experience helping GME programs and sponsoring institutions navigate accreditation requirements while building structures that support long-term success. Their work focuses on moving organizations beyond reactive accreditation preparation by establishing sustainable processes for oversight, monitoring, and accountability, and continuous improvement. Through this approach, they help institutions strengthen program quality, proactively identify risk, and create a culture of continuous accreditation readiness. Now let me turn the session over to our speakers. Alyson, you can begin.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for joining. Now, first beginning out, accreditation should not be treated as an event that periodically interrupts our regular work. Accreditation is most sustainable when it becomes part of everyday operations, how we monitor performance, document decisions, and address concerns. This mind shift is the foundation for everything we will discuss in this next section. The traditional model concentrates effort around deadlines, site visits, or annual submissions, as you can see here on the left-hand side. This is really preparing for when an accreditation milestone is approaching. This can create last-minute documentation scramble and place too much responsibility on one person on the team. Now, a sustainable model on the right is what we want to look forward to, which is where we're maintaining accreditation readiness throughout the year. A sustainable model distributes the work throughout the year with proactive planning, continuous monitoring, and shared accountability. Now, the goal is not to be in a constant state of survey preparation or citation responses. The goal is to make readiness a natural result of well-designed operations. Also thinking, if accreditation work feels like an emergency every time a deadline approaches, that is usually a sign that it has not yet been fully integrated into routine operations. Now, most institutions encounter several predictable barriers. First, GME teams are balancing accreditation alongside many other operational demands, often with limited time and resources within the team. Leadership turnover can disrupt processes, especially when responsibilities are not clearly documented. Different programs within the institution may also use different systems and have varying levels of accreditation experience within each of those programs. And these conditions encourage teams to fall back into that reactive preparation. Again, the key message is that sustainable readiness does not necessarily require more resources. It requires greater consistency. By having clear expectations, shared accountability, standardized processes, and routine follow-up can help compensate for limited resources. Now we will focus the majority of our presentation here on the 5 pillars of continuous readiness to give you ideas for your programs and institutions. Now, all of these pillars are interconnected, meaning if there's a weakness in one area, it can often create pressure that flows into others. The 5 pillars include governance, which establishes how decisions are made and who is responsible. Next is monitoring, which tells us whether our processes and programs are performing as expected. Then we have documentation, which is very important and provides the evidence. Next is accountability, which ensures concerns result in ownership and follow-through within the programs and institutions. And then lastly is continuous improvement, which turns findings into sustained change. Now, again, the objective is not to create 5 separate work streams or add a bunch of additional responsibilities to your teams. It is to integrate all 5 into a single operating model. Now, beginning with the first pillar, which we mentioned is governance. Strong governance begins with clear expectations, including what must be done, who owns it, and when it must occur. Oversight responsibilities should be explicit across the GMEC and institutional leaders, committees, and within the programs themselves. Standard policies and procedures reduce unnecessary variation across the institution and also support reliable decisions and decision-making processes. Active leadership involvement is also essential, particularly when concerns require escalation or resources. And good governance does not make the right action clear. Teams should have to rediscover the process each time an issue arises. So now, how can your institution and program put good governance into action? We've included a couple of examples here as we'll talk through examples for each of the pillars. So starting with quarterly leadership meetings or another cadence that you deem necessary, you could bring forward key leaders for a regular forum to discuss risk and priorities before they become urgent. Also, annual accreditation planning allows the institution to align goals, responsibilities, and deadlines. For example, we always know the annual update is due in August or September for our programs. How are we actively preparing so that we are not completing that annual update or beginning it a week before its deadline? Looking at leadership scorecards, this makes progress and ownership visible to the leaders of the organization. What things are current programs working on, who is responsible, and when are those deadlines supposed to be achieved? A coordinated policy review schedule institution-wide. Whether your GMEC is regularly reviewing and approving those policies, if there are changes, there still should be review at the GME office level to ensure that any changes in requirements or HR process changes are being reflected in those policies. And then lastly, a GMEC dashboard review. Again, reviewing compliance trends, outstanding actions, and any areas of concern within the programs or institution. And again, having that continuous follow-up to monitor change. By implementing some or all of these practices here, it can create a predictable rhythm for oversight. Next, we have pillar 2, which is monitoring. So monitoring allows the institution to see emerging risk early. Relevant data should be centralized through dashboards, calendars, or other tracking tools. Reviews or tasks that need to occur throughout the year will help prepare so that we're not only focused on surveys or site visits. And being able to look at trends is more valuable than examining a single data point in isolation. So has there consistently been negative trends on our ACGME survey? Has there been a citation that has not been resolved? Has there been continuous work hour complaints? Things like that, being able to identify those trends early can really help monitor to be able to fix that problem sooner. And again, monitoring only adds value and findings lead to action. Things like investigation, assigned ownership, that follow-up improvement really help this pillar move forward and be useful to your organization. We're not trying to necessarily collect more data with monitoring here. It's helping us identify the right signals to respond early enough. Now I want to talk a little bit more regarding monitoring leading versus lagging indicators. So on the left, we have leading indicators, which are indicators that signal that a problem may be developing. This could be things like late or incomplete evaluations, complaints from residents or fellows, declining faculty participation in something like didactics, negative survey results, concerning case logs, so on and so forth. And we also have lagging indicators. These are outcomes that show a problem that has already affected performance. We have already gotten a citation from the ACGME or area for improvement. We've already received a warning status, poor board pass rates, site visit findings, things that really have already occurred that we're showing up late in order to fix. Institutions need both types of information, but monitoring systems place particular emphasis on the leading indicators. We want to try to identify those problems early so that they don't necessarily turn into lagging indicators and they're hindering accreditation. The most important thing to keep in mind, especially when it comes to citations, is that a citation should rarely be the first time we're hearing of an issue. We should have heard complaints or seen findings on evaluations or surveys beforehand before it got to that point. Now, institutions and programs may monitor different areas of their responsibilities depending on your institution. So we have a couple examples here, and again, it might slightly differ, but just wanted to be able to provide different examples. So institutional monitoring focuses on organization-wide responsibilities, such as required policies of the GMEC, the annual institutional review, or the AIR completion, ADS updates when it comes to the institution side of things, survey participation, and special reviews. Really anything that is necessary for all programs to follow that fall underneath that sponsoring institution. And then we have program level monitoring, which looks more closely at specific resident and fellow evaluations, work hour reports, case logs, scholarly activity progress, milestones, and again, those program specific outcomes like recruitment and retention and board pass rates. Now, follow-up action plans are important at both levels for the institution and the program. Something like a monthly review can create a consistent line of sight while allowing time for intervention. And to reinforce, the institutional view shows us the overall system, while the program helps us identify where targeted support may be needed. And now we have a couple examples for our pillar 2 here for monitoring in action and what your institution can do to implement this. This again includes a shared accreditation dashboard, which can create a view of performance, trends, risk, and open actions that the program is working on. An annual compliance calendar can prevent recurring responsibilities from depending on memory, or especially if coordinators change or move throughout the year. A survey trend analysis is particularly helpful to review the resident fellow feedback as well as the faculty feedback and identify additional patterns and concerns. Has there been a specific area that has slowly been decreasing? Has it recently decreased and then increased? What was the impact of that and why did that occur? Really trying to narrow down the survey can provide a lot of insights into your program and institution. Having a citation and an area for improvement tracking can show the finding, responsible owner, deadline, corrective action, and evidence of closure, which are all things that you would need in order to respond to an ACGME citation on ADS. And again, self-audits and focused reviews allow teams to examine a potential concern before it develops into a larger issue. And again, these tools should simplify the work and make follow-up visible, not necessarily add additional layers of administration. Now moving on to pillar 3, which is documentation. Now, documentation is the evidence that processes occurred, decisions were made, and improvement was completed. Standard templates and naming conventions make records easier to create and retrieve. Meeting minutes, approvals, and action logs preserve the rationale behind those decisions. Centralized repositories reduce dependency on individual staff members. And version control and routine reviews help ensure materials remain accurate and current. And the standard should be that another knowledgeable person can locate the evidence, understand what happened, and determine whether the issue was resolved. If there are things like CCC meeting minutes that do not accurately show any decisions, action plans, or follow-up regarding a resident performance, and we have to look back at those meeting minutes 2 years from now, we're not going to remember exactly what happened. So we need to be able to document enough so that we could go back and be knowledgeable as to what actually occurred during that meeting and any further decisions or action items. So when it comes to documentation, there are a lot of risks that can occur, such as files stored on individual devices or desktop, which can become inaccessible when someone is unavailable or leaves the organization. Multiple versions can create uncertainty about which document is truly the source of truth. Multiple versions could be saved on someone's desktop, the individual that took the meeting minutes, and another version sent via email. Really being able to have a shared folder that documents the final version is very helpful. Outdated policies, if we're updating any type of GMAC policies, we want to be able to have a shared folder where not only the GMAC members and GME leaders can go, but also the trainees and faculty can go. And if there's 2 versions of a policy and it's not necessarily clear which one they should be looking at, that can create large risk for the institution. Any type of meeting minutes or committee meeting that needs approvals or further actions must make it very clear in terms of those decisions and action items, as well as deadlines for monitoring. This can ensure there's accountability and responsibility for those individuals that attended. And these are not merely administrative inconveniences. They can create accreditation and continuity risk. Really, a helpful question I would like you all to think about is for every important record or document to think, is it current? Is it complete? Can the right people find it? And does it show follow through? Effective documentation should make readiness easier, not simply to create more files. And now I will pass it off to Claire, who will take us through the remaining part of the presentation.
Thank you, Alyson. So onto our 4th pillar, accountability. This is really where readiness moves from being more of a concept to becoming an operative process. So one of the biggest risks that we oftentimes see is when accreditation is viewed as the responsibility of the GME office alone. Sustainable readiness requires participation across the institution, which includes institutional leaders, program teams, faculty, coordinators, any committees that are involved, as well as residents and fellows. Now, this is not to say that everyone needs to own every requirement per se, but everyone should understand what they're responsible for. They need to understand what needs to be escalated and how that escalation process works, and how their work connects to the accreditation readiness. A strong accountability structure also makes follow-through visible, a few things that Alyson touched on. So it should be clear who owns the action and when it's due, as well as how we know that it was actually completed, so ensuring that that follow-through is in place. The goal is to create shared responsibility without creating any sort of confusion or duplication at both the program and institutional levels. One practical way to create that clarity and ensure accountability is through an accreditation responsibility matrix. So in this example, we've outlined a few major accreditation activities that are involved throughout the academic year, And for each of these, there should ideally be both a primary owner who's responsible for completing the work, as well as a clearly defined reviewer or individual who's responsible for providing oversight. Now, these two items are different. The person completing the work may not ultimately be the person who's responsible or accountable for ensuring a requirement is met. For example, for the annual ADS update, which is the season we're going through now, oftentimes the program coordinator or institutional coordinator is the main player in uploading information, completing questions, and ensuring that the operational pieces of ADS are complete. But the program director or DIO, who are really those key leaders, still have the responsibility for ensuring that the information is accurate, complete, and that any outstanding items are addressed prior to submission. This type of matrix can also be helpful during any sort of leadership or coordinator transition or turnover, which we know occurs unfortunately, because these responsibilities are attached more so to a role rather than an individual. So ensuring that information or knowledge is not siloed to one person and can stay consistent across programs and providing that institutional oversight. One good exercise when looking at this matrix that we recommend institutions to run through is looking at your major accreditation activities and asking if this was due tomorrow or if this wasn't completed by tomorrow, would everyone know who's responsible for completing it and would everyone know who's responsible for reviewing it? Accountability is also essentially important, particularly when a concern or an issue has been identified. So while identifying the issue is only the first step, readiness depends on having a process in place for moving that issue through to resolution, as well as ensuring that everyone involved in the process knows what it is and what that escalation process looks like. So this means clearly defining the concern, as well as providing any supporting evidence that could help get a better understanding of what the issue is, assigning an accountable owner or owners who are responsible for coordinating the response and ensuring follow through to resolution, developing an action plan, and depending on what the issue is, this might look slightly different, but then looking at the resources and expected outcomes that are needed to address the issue. Next is establishing a realistic timeline, and part of that includes highlighting any interim milestones that need to be checked off or reviewed to maintain momentum and clarify expectations moving forward. Monitoring progress is especially important to ensure that any barriers that come up are able to be addressed before that timeline runs out or before that due date occurs. And finally, reporting to GMEC. So this includes sharing any progress, outcomes, or unresolved risks that GMEC should be aware of as the appropriate oversight body. One common gap that we see throughout this process is that organizations are often very good at identifying the issues, but less consistent about documenting closure. So we want to be able to show not only what the concern was and what we intended to do, but also what changed throughout the process, whether the intervention worked, if different routes were need to be taken, if other documentation was needed, and then finally, who reviewed the outcome to ensure that resolution. It's very important that GMEC is kept informed of these types of processes because it ensures to the ACGME that the appropriate oversight body was involved and any unresolved issues or risks can then be addressed at the institutional level. Ultimately, having this type of process is what helps to ensure that accreditation findings or issues can turn into measurable outcomes rather than a series of open action items with no one being held accountable and timelines being missed. So the fifth pillar is continuous improvement, and this is really what moves institutions and programs beyond that basic compliance. So a readiness strategy that institutions can ask themselves is not only are we meeting this requirement, but it's also asking what are we learning and how can we make the system or processes in place better. Transparency is really important in creating this culture of continuous readiness because it helps to create openness around performance, risks, and opportunities for improvement. Again, we want to look at the accreditation cycle in a comprehensive manner and not something that is identifying deficiencies and placing blame, but rather how can we improve? What are some areas we need to focus on and prioritize? Regular communication and feedback loops also help leaders understand what's happening across their programs, and as Alyson kind of keyed in on earlier, can help identify trends that may not be as obvious if you're looking at one program by itself. Being able to share that communication, any process updates or important changes that were made at the program level can then help that institution look at the institution at a larger scale. Data should ultimately also drive this decision making. So looking at different things such as survey results, outcomes, any trends that are notable, and operational metrics can help determine where leadership attention and resources might be needed more heavily now than in the future. Ultimately, the objective here is to create a culture where deficiencies are not viewed as failures again, but more as opportunities to strengthen the educational environment and ensure that all aspects of the GME office, whether that be leaders or all the way down to residents and fellows, are aware and held accountable for their different responsibilities. So keying in further on this culture of continuous improvement, it's oftentimes built through relatively small but continuous behaviors and actions. It's really important for leadership to model the expectations that they have for their programs and other leaders. So if the DIO or coordinators are routinely asking about readiness at the program level, are following up about certain metrics or items that are due, and constantly aiming for improvement, the programs will understand that these are institutional priorities and therefore be more involved and more engaged when these things come up. Regular communication also makes it easier for programs to surface concerns before they become larger risks. So if your institution is one that doesn't necessarily talk about an issue until it comes up, or it's made a citation or an area for improvement, it may be frowned upon to bring those things up ahead of time and look to get in front of it. So again, that's being proactive rather than reactive. So having those open chains of communication is integral to ensuring that things can be addressed earlier on. It's also important to encourage feedback, so from all levels of GME, including residents, fellows, faculty, coordinators, and leaders. They should all feel that raising an issue results in thoughtful review rather than defensiveness or placing blame. It's equally important to recognize improvement. So when a concern is raised and it is reviewed in depth and a process is changed or integrated, notifying that and being recognized for that improvement really goes a long way. Oftentimes, this continuous readiness can feel very compliance focused or task focused. So acknowledging progress when it occurs helps reinforce the behaviors that you ultimately want to promote and sustain. I'd also like to highlight coordinator support. So as we all know, coordinators oftentimes carry around a very large amount of operational knowledge within the program, ensuring that they have the training, the standard templates, peer networking opportunities, and development are important readiness strategies as well, so that the role itself can continue to maintain accountability, documentation, and enhance that knowledge throughout their program and institution. So up to this point, we've talked about these 5 pillars of continuous readiness. And the next question is, how do we actually put those concepts into practice? So operationalizing readiness means translating that governance, monitoring, documentation, accountability, and improvement into recurring activities. Now, the goal here is not necessarily to create more work. Ideally, it's to organize the work that you're already doing, the processes you already have in place, and turn that into a way that's more consistent, visible, and proactive that benefits the institution in the long run. So on this slide, we have a few readiness questions and practical tools that are a great place to start if you're looking to implement some of these strategies. A few of these questions Alyson touched on in earlier slides, but looking at the readiness questions on the left, a few items that you could go through include, can we quickly locate the documentation we would need to demonstrate compliance? So if the site visitor came tomorrow and asked for a policy that's not part of the norm, would you be able to find it, let's say? If you are able to find it, is it current? When was the last time it was reviewed, updated? When was the last time it was shared with residents and fellows and faculty? Are they aware of the process in place? Going into question number 3, do programs understand their expectations when it comes to their roles and responsibilities? Are action plans being monitored through completion, and is that oversight occurring on a regular basis? And finally, if there are any risks, does executive leadership understand and know what these accreditation risks are? These questions may sound simple, but they can be very revealing, such as if the answer to one of these is not consistently, that usually identifies an opportunity to strengthen the underlying process and maybe take a step back and see how improvement can be made. Now, the tools listed on the right here may not apply for every institution and may not be necessarily needed, but we wanted to provide a few examples of things that can be standardized across the institutional level. So evidence repositories, policy trackers, dashboards, internal review templates, so on and so forth. These aren't intended to create bureaucracy from the institutional level, but rather they should make readiness easier by creating that visibility, consistency, and institutional memory rather than individual memory. It's also important to note that organizations do not need all of these on day one. The best approach is to select the tools that may be most beneficial to you or can address the most significant gaps that you currently are facing. Switching gears a little bit and looking at the accreditation risks, which can occur if these 5 pillars are not in place. These risks often don't just appear out of nowhere. Typically, there are warning signs well before a formal finding occurs or a formal report is given. Many of the items on the slide are leading indicators, so things like delayed evaluations, declining survey results, incomplete annual reviews. And while one of these may not represent a serious accreditation problem, the concern happens when we see patterns or recurrence or multiple of these indicators moving in the wrong direction at the same time. So looking at this list, and for example, a decline in survey results may deserve attention. We see this happen. It's usually not necessarily indicative of something larger. However, it becomes indicative of something larger if a decline in survey results is paired with leadership turnover or delayed evaluations or unresolved action plans. And this is really where it starts to tell a larger story that requires a much closer look. Continuous readiness then allows us to identify those patterns earlier and intervene before they become citations, as Alyson mentioned, or broader program concerns that could be detrimental. I would encourage organizations to determine which warning signs, if any, are present at their program or institution and routinely review those at both levels to ensure that they're not indicative of something larger and can be addressed now rather than waiting and being reactive in case a site visit does occur. Now, on the flip side of the accreditation risk factors, there are also best practices that can help you reduce that risk. And I do want to point out that one theme across almost everything on this list is standardization. So implementing standard internal reviews, work plans, dashboards, and monitoring can help reduce any unnecessary variation across programs. This is not to say that standardization means every program needs to operate identically. We know that programs have different requirements. There are different resources that are needed. They have different expectations. But one thing that should be consistent and can be consistent is that institutional framework. So how are risks identified? How are concerns escalated? How are actions being tracked? And how does oversight occur? If this is not a consistent metric across all of your programs, this is definitely an area that you can take a closer look and try and standardize what you can that will help each program operate effectively. These practices in place on this slide also help to make the system more resilient when there is turnover, because again, the process does not depend on one individual remembering how something is done. It's about the role being responsible for that. And that's why you have those team peer networking opportunities for different coordinators, let's say, to understand those roles and responsibilities. The goal here is to create a reliable institutional infrastructure that supports programs rather than asking each program to independently develop their own readiness practice. Perfect. So one of the most effective ways to create that continuous readiness is to distribute activities throughout the academic year. As we all know, one of the great things about the academic year is that it's cyclical. So a lot of the items or deadlines or due dates are predictable in nature. Rather than having everything converge around an accreditation milestone, such as a site visit or a deadline, institutions can build kind of an annual calendar per se that aligns recurring requirements with predictable timeframes. For example, and as shown on the slide, the first quarter, July to September, can focus more heavily on policy review, annual ADS updates, and program health assessments. Since this is a really great time between orientation and onboarding being completed and recruitment and interview season not yet starting, you may have more time to get through some of these items more so than throughout the rest of the academic year, where more deadlines are occurring and you just naturally get busier. Later quarters can then focus on internal reviews, survey preparation, faculty development, which is usually ongoing, and any strategic planning that needs to occur from last year's APE or the AIR. The exact calendar will look different at every institution, but the great thing is that a lot of these deadlines are the same year after year. So making the work predictable can be a great feature to share across your institution. This can also help to ensure that teams can plan ahead. So if there's any planned PTO, ensuring that the deadlines are met prior to that. Leadership can anticipate when decisions will be needed. And GMAC oversight becomes more systematic because you're already planning in advance for certain things that need to be reviewed or voted on. It also helps to reduce the likelihood of important activities becoming dependent on one person. Again, not siloing this to one individual, rather to a role that they're responsible for. Perfect. So looking at all of these concepts and wondering kind of what is the best place to start, this roadmap that we've outlined here is intended to make this work more manageable, breaking it up over a 90-day course. So in the first 30 days, focusing on understanding what is your current state assessment, what are the existing accreditation processes in place, taking an inventory of the tools and documentation you have, and then identifying gaps that may be existent without the programs or in the institution. This can help you to determine your priorities, which will then feed into days 31 through 60. At which point you can start really building out that infrastructure. So developing or refining any dashboards that you have in place, creating that annual accreditation calendar already with those deadlines that we know throughout the academic year and adding in those ad hoc items, standardizing any documentation that you can, and then clarifying roles and responsibilities. Finally, in days 61 through 90, you can really then begin operationalizing those structures. So holding internal reviews, ensuring leadership reporting is ongoing, and evaluate what is actually working. What did we realize within the last 60 days? What's working for us now? And what maybe needs to be further refined in the future? The important point is that organizations do not need to redesign their entire accreditation strategy at once. Start with the highest risk or least standardized areas and put a few systems in place to figure out what works best for you and your institution. Continuous readiness itself should be approached through continuous improvement. And finally, bring it all together. One key takeaway that we would like for you all to have after this webinar is that accreditation readiness should be treated as an ongoing operational strategy rather than a periodic exercise that's only done as needed. Governance helps to create clarity around how decisions are made and who provides that oversight. Monitoring helps us identify risks before they become a formal finding or citation. Documentation allows us to demonstrate that our processes are actually occurring and they work. Accountability ensures that identified concerns result in action and follow through. And finally, that continuous improvement helps to ensure that we are learning from those experiences rather than just checking a compliance box. It's also important to note that none of these pillars work well by themselves. It's important that they work together and reinforce one another to ensure that this accreditation strategy works best for your institution. When these practices become embedded into everyday GME operations, that's when accreditation preparation becomes less disruptive and less ad hoc, and you're really acting on more of a proactive basis. That's ultimately what we mean by building a sustainable accreditation strategy, is that creating systems and processes that support compliance, quality, and improvement all year long.
We'll now open the floor for questions from the audience. If you have a question, please type it in the chat. We're going to start with, how do you know when an accreditation concern can be addressed at the program level versus when it should be elevated to the sponsoring institution or to executive leadership?
Yeah, I can take this one. Thank you, Susan. So a concern can generally remain at the program level, especially when it's isolated, low risk, and within the program's authority and resources to be able to correct. It can be elevated to the institution or leadership level if it presents a significant compliance or learner safety risk. Maybe it affects multiple programs. Maybe it requires change of institutional policies themselves at the larger level, or it's not being improved at the program level itself. So I think it's really important to think of some examples here. So something at the program level that could be addressed is maybe incomplete or late evaluations from the residents, versus something at the institutional level could be maybe there's concerns with supervision in the ICU. And we know we have multiple programs rotating within the ICU itself. So that would need to be elevated to that higher level because it's affecting more programs. And we might need to get leadership involved from that authority to be able to handle that concern. So I think at the end of the day, it's not really can the program handle this, it's does the program have the authority and the ability and the resources to resolve that concern itself.
Sense. What are some of the most common gaps you see at institutions that appear well prepared on paper but struggle to demonstrate readiness in practice?
Yeah, I can take this one. One of the biggest gaps that I see is policies that do not fully reflect practice. So while your policies may be compliant from an ACG requirement perspective, are the processes that complement those policies actually occurring, and are they what works best for your program or institution? Another area that we see as a gap is that inconsistent oversight and follow through on key processes or action items. So again, ensuring that you have documentation on what it is, ensuring you have the right people in place that can be held accountable, and then finally ensuring that follow through for continuous improvement. I think a good question is asking, do we have the evidence that meets the requirement, but do we also have the right people in place to see it through and provide that resolution?
And then how can institutions maintain consistency across programs while still allowing individual programs flexibility to address their unique needs?
I think this is a great question, and questions we get a lot here. So really, as Claire had especially mentioned, the institution should be able to provide the framework and the expectations for that process and documentation, whether that is specific templates they want you to use or specific action items or dashboards to be able to track those concerns in the monitoring. But the program should have the flexibility to achieve those outcomes, especially because we know programs have different requirements, they're different specialties, different sizes, things like that. A program may have concerns with case logs, and another program does not need to report any case logs. So being able for the programs with case logs in this example to be able to have the flexibility to really determine those individual processes, but then to report out at the institutional level. So the goal really is the standard accountability, not really identical operations from each program because they can be different. So a really useful approach that I think is helpful is for the institution to establish that framework. And again, whether it's standardized templates that can really easily be used across programs or calendars, but then the programs have the space to actually measure the outcome and the concern and delegate that action plan.
Great. I have one more right now. So for programs and institutions that want to start implementing more readiness practices, what's the best place to start?
Yeah, I think this goes hand in hand with a little bit of what Alyson just touched on. I think a great exercise is running through that accreditation matrix. So identifying all of your key responsibilities and tasks throughout the academic year, ensuring that you have people responsible for completing it and that a review or oversight is actually occurring. that's where I believe you can find those gaps that kind of talked through that roadmap in the first 30 days, is understanding what are we missing, what are maybe some processes that need to be improved within our program or across the board, and then ensuring you have the resources and institutional feedback and support as needed to ensure that those get put in place.
Great. Well, thank you today to our presenters for the information and insights that were provided. In wrapping up our session, we want to thank you all for participating. And as noted earlier, you'll receive an email this afternoon with a short survey to complete, as well as a copy of the presentation. If you have any outstanding questions after today's presentation, please email Hunter Rich at hrich@germane-solutions.com. And for your educational information, please visit our LinkedIn page and our website for details and registration information for the next webinar. Our marketing team will also follow up with all the attendees via email with a direct link to register. And then finally, to be included in any important future announcements, follow Germane Solutions on LinkedIn or contact us on the website. Thank you again for participating in today's webinar.